Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Inshallah, hope everybody's having a good afternoon. I was taking a break. I was doing some reading and listening to a book by a Catholic academic who mainly writes on the confluence of religion and psychology, and his name is Paul C. Vitz. His last name is Vitz, V-I-T-Z, and I think he has a book, and it's called Religion versus Psychology, and it's a great book. I highly recommend it, even though obviously he's a Catholic. He's not a Muslim, but I think generally his views on the differences of the approach to the human being between how religion approaches the human being, and specifically, obvious for him, Catholicism, although he does invoke the whole Judeo-Christian thing and makes no mention of Islam. He will on occasion say, and other religions in general, but I suppose I would do no different as a Muslim. I probably wouldn't bother invoking Catholicism or Christianity. But putting those things aside, his commentary on the relationship between these two and the challenges that people today have in you could say in distinguishing between religion and psychology, and how a great many religious people who feel that they are being religious and are having religious experiences are practicing not only psychology, but are practicing something that really deep at its root is very anti-religion. And so he kind of does this genealogy, which I think again is really worthwhile, of modern psychological thought. Where did it come from? So of course he touches on Freud, but he goes beyond Freud, where he talks about Jung, he talks about Rogers, he talks about Maslow, he talks about many important heavy hitters in the field of psychology, and also what he refers to as the theorists of the self. So there are these psychologists, but then there's also these theorists of the self. What is the self, and a lot of it is really revealing about how at the core of a lot of psychology is shirk, because it's a kind of tahleel, meaning that it wants to make the human being divine, and depending on which school of thought or which author that you're talking about, it can be more direct about your divine self and all this other nonsense, and then for others it's a bit more subtle. But if you kind of drill down enough, they all kind of come right. They all sort of come together, and I think his not just this one book. He has a couple of other books as well. I think his research is really important in that it makes me curious about those Muslims who are in the field of psychology. How have they tackled these challenges? Are they aware of them, and how are they tackling these challenges? Because I feel that a lot of what passes as spirituality in our community, whether that be in the form of, I would say probably less tazkiyat nafs, because usually if you're going to invoke specifically tazkiyat nafs, you're probably coming from a more Salafi, maybe an Athari background, whereas those who tend to invoke Sufism or Tasawwuf in my observation, tend to be those who are more open to a sort of syncretic blending of psychology and so-called Islamic, or as I would prefer, Muslim spirituality. They're either going to try to make like a smoothie of that, or they will just say that, well, ilm al-nafs, right? Psychology is ilm al-nafs. And I guess, and all you need to do to make that something legitimate is just to translate it to Arabic. And so when I was having dinner the other night with my friend Ubaidullah Evans, with Ustad Ubaidullah, we were noting that there's a massive problem with the uncritical digesting of the istiraha, or just the nomenclature, the terminology of secularism, and particularly of psychology, of Western secular psychology. And when I said, just imagine if you were to say to not just a native speaker of Arabic, but imagine, just go back like 100 years and say to a native speaker of Arabic, hubb al-nafs, self-love. They would be like, what the hell are you saying? And it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And so I think that we have some homework to do. Now, this isn't just, I'm not bringing this up because, well, we're not getting the semantics right, even though semantics are very important. I think, however, what comes out of this semantic deviance comes actual deviance itself, like comes fisq and kufr. And what I mean is that by making everything about the self, without really going into much of a discourse on, well, what is the self and where did it come from, which is something that in general psychology is not very interested in. It's like, well, that doesn't matter, it's here, and we're going to label it, right, these things, and we're going to prescribe this or that thing to do to it. And that's why you've seen people increasingly in the modern age turn away from traditional forms of religion. And what I mean by that is not just like Christians turning to psychoastrology and that kind of thing, but I think even in the Muslim community, Muslims do not turn to the Quran as a thing to fix something, to diagnose themselves, to know what is a good person, what is a bad person, to diagnose themselves and to fix it, nor to the Sunnah. And so this kind of increases and exacerbates the tendency for Muslims in the modern age to see the Quran, even if they're only doing so, subconsciously or unwittingly, as kind of irrelevant, or it's just a book of, it's like a book of poetry and aphorisms and arcane, laws and that kind of thing. But it is not a book that's really going to intimately tell you about who you are and what you're made out of and how you should be. And in fact, I think this is something that has led to the kind of relativism that we find growing rampantly in our community, where Muslims tend to have embraced a kind of post-secular Muslimic, Islamic kind of relativism, where everybody can go and have their own truth. And so truth doesn't reside in the Book of Allah. Truth is not discovered through, and when I say truth, right, obviously truth in the Book of Allah is going to be truth with a capital T. And when I say truth in the tradition, I obviously mean that truth with a small t, but truths nonetheless. Well, now we cast that away, because that's the issue with all, at the very root of all modern psychologies, the assumptions that they're built off of, right? And this is something I think Vitz does a very, very good job of bringing out. Again, Catholic, Jew, whatever, very, very good at bringing to light what are some of the fundamental assumptions, particularly the unarticulated assumptions that psychology operates off of. He's very good at doing this in his book. And one of those is there is no foundational truth as to what is right and wrong, and there is no foundational truth of what is beautiful and ugly, and there is no foundational truth, period. And so they then go and then proceed to construct out of paper mache, I might add, a foundation of what the human being is, and therefore this thing that they call the self. And so it's no coincidence that out of this then we have had the development of terminology in that space, such as mind and mental. What is mind and mental? I think one of the great travesties of the modern age is that they have actually, they've made a maqluba out of, or they've flipped it upside down, the heart and the aql. Right now, we say the aql is the brain or the mind. I mean, the mind, the word mind is really a complete abstract term that we use as this sort of like very gray repository to put what we don't understand and then say, well, we call it the mind. What the hell is the mind? Nobody really knows what the mind is. And therefore mental illness. I mean, there's actually a very interesting book called The Myth of Mental Illness. And I know this will probably be somewhat controversial for many in our community, because now our community has enthusiastically jumped on board on the mental health train and the labeling everything as mental health this and mental health that, with never a discussion of the heart. So, if a person commits suicide in our community, we will talk about mental health. But if a person sexually abuses somebody in our community, then we say, oh, that's an evil, bad person, they have a bad heart. But if a person commits suicide, it's never an issue of the heart. And I know if you were to say this to people, right, it might seem insensitive, and that's why I'm not talking about anybody's particular suicide, but just in general, this is very problematic when we know that the nusus of Islam, like the core texts that inform us of what truth is and what morality is, are emphatic that taking one's life is haram, right? It's inviolable. It is a major sin that will be punished in the hereafter. And yet now it is virtually impossible to have any discussion with Muslims today about, say, suicide, in which you could talk about, well, maybe that person's heart, what was going on with their heart? No, it's all mental health. And what we're seeing now is like a kind of tide that is rolling over the community and reformatting their understanding of what morality is. And that if you can just, without probable cause, so to speak, without a warrant, with a no-knock warrant, you can just burst down the door and change suicide now to purely an issue of mental health. If that can be done to suicide, then it's just a matter of time, and it's happening in other areas, of where now everything will be rendered mental health. And there will be no longer talk of things that are objectively moral and immoral, right or wrong. And what we now have is a victimizing of Muslims. And what I may say victim is that, a person, let's say they attempted suicide, they didn't succeed, right? They attempt suicide, and this all has to do how they are the victim of their mom, their dad, their culture, their society, their this or that. They are, the victim, and then people will applaud this. And so now we also valorize the victimization of people. I find this very deeply concerning. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. apparently I've chosen to take my coffee break at some sort of like dump truck convention. Now we're going to valorize people being victims, and that sends a horrible message even to people who just in general, like, how do we want to discuss that? It's one thing to say that, well, perhaps there are some instances of where people took their lives, and as we would say, al-qalb marfu' alayh, right? Like the pen was lifted off them and they were not responsible. And we do have that, not just for suicide, but in general. Like we have a thing where people can become majnoon, right? People can have junoon, they can have insanity of which they don't have responsibility for their actions. So we already have that, as you could say, baked into our religion. But that's a very different kind of muscle, and that's a very, very different kind of mechanics than going back and rewriting things foundationally from the ground up and removing that to where now there is no possibility of somebody committing a sin and they being blameworthy in committing that sin. I think this is a very dangerous moment that we're in for that. And I'm concerned that a lot of just what I see of people, Muslims working in the field, and I don't, I'm not naming any names, but I just am being honest. I'm very concerned of what I see about people, teaching so-called spirituality. And I've always said, what is that? It's such a completely amorphous term. There's no agreement on it. That I'm very worried about what direction we're going, where are we headed with this, and that this could spell disastrous consequences going forward for the resiliency of our community. Because if we valorize being a victim and we also make everybody a victim ubiquitously, like that's just by default, people are victims, that doesn't bode well for a future as a community to perpetuate ourselves into the future. That seems that we are going to be cutting our own throats, so to speak, when we talk about suicide. That does not bear well. So I'm thinking perhaps to do just like a reading of this book to discuss it. I don't want to overhype him as if he's a one-stop shop, but I do feel like, and it's great because he is an academic. He gives lots of citation of sources, so he's not just kind of rattling things off the top of his head. So, maybe doing a reading of this in the future, and again looking at some of the additional sources and having a conversation about this could, inshallah, be something beneficial for us to think how we want to proceed, and kind of like anything else, how do we want to adopt? Or how do we want to imbibe, or how do we want to digest that and bring that into the fold of our community? There should be a question of A, do we want to, and B, to what extent? And we should very much be in a position of oversight of what elements of that we are in a constant state of reassessing of we perhaps might be able to accept that. And then also, undoubtedly, there will be aspects to say, no, that part of it, absolutely no, we cannot accept that. So maybe if you're interested in that, that's something we could do going forward, as we either on some live streams or some pre-recorded videos, or maybe even a class at middle ground. So inshallah, let me know your thoughts on that. Got to go pick up the kid from school. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.